Hello, and thank you so much for listening to this installment of the EUTERPE podcasts. Today, I'm here with Minal Sukumar, a writer, performance poet, and PhD researcher at the Center for Women's Studies at the University of York. Minal was around 10 years old when she decided to get into the business of telling stories, a phase some are still waiting for her to outgrow. In 2017, she co-founded the Bangalore-based poetry collective Mouth of Word, and has performed original spoken word poetry in India, Ireland, and the UK. Minal holds an MA in English Literature from Bangalore University, India, and an MA in Writing from the University of Galway, Ireland. Minal's creative work has appeared in several publications, including South Asia's leading literary magazine, The Bombay Review. She was awarded a Wolfson Scholarship in 2022, and her creative critical research explores women's spatiality through contemporary Indian fiction. Today, we have the pleasure of listening to her readings of some of her poems and discussing her work and her life more generally. Minal, thank you so much for being here with me.
This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
Minal, thank you so much for being with me here today. I'm very excited to hear some of your poetry and to also talk a little bit about your writing process and your life and your own kind of experiences of being a poet. So to begin with, I think you're going to share a reading with us of one of your poems.
Firstly, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, I will start with one of my poems. It's called #OOTD, or Outfit of the Day. And it goes something like this. I don't remember when I first learned my skin carries controversy. Only that I've stood in front of an open closet for decades, this body a map of negotiations, calculations clicking in the jaw. One party plus one car plus one round trip equals one miniskirt. One party minus one car plus two male friends equals one pair of jeans and one crop top. One party plus two cab rides plus four women equals one pair of flats, one jacket, and one bottle of pepper spray in a crossbody bag. When we were younger, the equation never stood still. It moved and changed, last-minute cancellations, overprotective guardians, partners who brought two wheels instead of four. And there we were again, step one of an exhausting math problem. When we were in school, we'd wait for scrutiny to turn its back before tucking in the waistband of our skirts with deft fingers, saving that extra half-inch of skin in school diaries. No one called that resistance. When we were teenagers, we wore leggings under dresses, ditched them in club bathrooms, collected photos as souvenirs of the cheapest freedom to be found, drinks in hand, smiles in place, cocoa-buttered limbs in focus, later dismantled and snuck back into bedrooms. No one called that resistance. When we got older, we also got bolder, meeting the water's cry in swimsuits, packing away tanned torsos in suitcases, climbing onto the back of a motorbike, 50% tequila, 50% tube top, pulling thorns from under rose petals to hold in front of sequined mesh. No one called that resistance. Instead, they called it ugly. They called it slutty. They called it I will pray for you at Bible study. While characters on foreign channels, pop icons in music videos, glitzy Bollywood stars, women from distant worlds were learning to own their bodies. We could only borrow ours. So we kept a piece each time. A collarbone, the swell of a breast, prickly armpits, tattooed hip bones, ankles, knees, and with great courage, thighs, until our reflections told us we were whole, and we called that resistance.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I think this is the second or third time that I've heard you read this poem out loud, and each time I've picked up on different elements and just been very amazed and enthralled by the poem itself and the story that you kind of create with it and how much I can relate to some of the elements. But I think that we'll kind of discuss the poem in a little bit more detail later. But first, I'd like to ask a few questions kind of to contextualize your work and talk a little bit about yourself and your identity as a poet. So to begin with, my first question is, what brought you to poetry as a form of creative expression? And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your relationship to the form, how long you've been writing and performing, and why you choose to do it.
Thank you for that question. I actually kind of stumbled into poetry. I did always want to be a writer, even as a kid. But back then, I was all about fantasy and adventure and mystery, getting completely lost in made-up worlds, which I still enjoy immensely, don't get me wrong. But I came to appreciate poetry later, during my college years when I was often struggling with my mental health specifically, and found some solace in writing bad poetry. Then I discovered spoken word, and there was really no going back after that. It combined my passion for writing with a love for theater that my acting skills could never quite match. It was the perfect combination for me, and I fell in love with it from day one. At some point, poetry became the only way I could make sense of the messiness of being in this world. And even though I am still very much a bundle of nerves before every performance, I feel most like myself when I'm up there reading poetry. I haven't had the most consistent relationship with it, though, or with creative writing in general, to be honest. It's been very on and off, depending on life and energy. But I've been writing and performing poetry for about 9 years now, and I keep coming back to it.
You can definitely kind of hear it in your voice when you read a poem. And I've had the privilege to see you perform it live as well with an audience and everything. And at least from my perspective, throughout the course of hearing you read your poems, it feels as though your voice gains more like confidence and sense of like self as you continue to read. So this might even be something you're subconscious of, but as a listener, it definitely comes across that kind of entering that stage, even if of course nerves are tied up with it originally, you do become yourself. And that's really amazing to see. So my second question is kind of about your identity as an individual and as a writer. In our project, the EUTERPE project, we're thinking a lot about ideas of transnationalism and kind of investigating what makes a text transnational or what gives an author a transnational identity. And of course, it's a privilege to be able to speak to writers directly and to ask them about their own relationship to this term and whether or not they consider themselves a transnational writer. So this is what I would like to ask you. And if you do consider yourself a transnational writer, how does this idea of transnationalism manifest itself in the context of your life and your work? This can be anything from travels, studies, family, creativity, etc.
To be honest, I haven't really thought of myself that way. But I suppose in some ways it fits. I've lived in Ireland earlier, and now I'm doing a PhD here in the UK. So there's, of course, some sort of physical migration. Some of my writing came with me across borders, changed on the journey, made new connections, learned new things, found new life, much like me, really. But in more recent writing too, the questions and themes I keep returning to still feel very rooted in where I come from, even as they shift and grow across places. My research also focuses on Indian fiction and the experiences of Indian women, Indian middle class women, to be specific. And it has been interesting to think about what is familiar in an unfamiliar environment. It does change that thought process, and it's really been fascinating to see how. When it comes to performing poetry, I do want to say what's truly powerful is seeing how people, especially women, connect with stories and feelings that are shaped by very different geographies than their own. That's what I love most about spoken word, I think. It creates an immediate sense of connection, an immediate bond, even solidarity in some ways, while holding space for difference. I found that I don't need to change the world of my poem for it to make sense in this one. And I think that's beautiful. Of course, this works best in the right room. Fortunately, I've had the pleasure of performing in the right rooms, especially here in York, at the university, but also where several amazing poetry collectives are creating safe spaces for stories to meet across borders. In the right room, where there is openness, I believe spoken word can build an almost magical in between space through mutuality and community. So I think in those ways, transnationalism does feature, even though I haven't really thought of myself or defined myself in those terms before.
Yeah, it's really interesting as I continue to kind of have these conversations with different authors to think about whether or not they have thought of that word in relation to their own work. And more often than not, I think they feel similarly to you, where sometimes imposing terms like that, I think, on your work from the outset can be a disservice. But then when you reflect on where your work circulates and how it connects you with other people, and particularly in the context of performance poetry, as you're talking about kind of this sense of collectivity and solidarity that comes along with it, maybe that's where we should be looking to have these conversations of transnationalism. At one of your performances, I remember it was amazing to like each of the three poets that were performing that day, including yourself, each were bringing, I think, their own experiences and sense of self and their own cultures to the stage. And then you saw the audience kind of bringing their own responses to that. And so it is kind of an interesting space to look at, this like performance stage, to think about these idea of transnationalism and collectivity and solidarity, because everybody kind of seems to come together in that moment. And suddenly things that you've never thought about before seem really relatable, or you're encountered with new words, new language, everything like that. So I think it was a very powerful experience, at least for me, and I really enjoyed it. So I love that you've already brought up kind of that aspect of performance and its relationship to transnationalism. So that does kind of actually lead into my next question really neatly, which is excellent. As you've already kind of hinted at, you're primarily a performance poet. And as your bio mentions, you've performed in India and the UK and Ireland. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the process of writing for performance and what it's been like performing in these different cultural contexts. Does it feel different performing in different places? Or does your connection with the audience change at all? Do you prefer one context over the other?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and multi-layered.
Yes.
I'll start with the first one. Writing for performance is both similar to and different from writing for the page. On one hand, the creative process, which when I say creative process, I mean coming up with ideas, shaping language, playing with rhythm. These things are pretty much the same across both. But when you're writing for performance, words aren't your only tool. Sometimes a facial expression, a change in tone, an alteration in how you're saying something, or even a hand gesture can carry the weight of a whole line. And you have to write those in too when you're writing for performance, or at least I do when I'm writing for performance. You also have to think about the audience in a way I think you don't really have to when you're writing for the page. That's not to say that there is no connection between reader and writer when you're reading poetry or reading a story on the page. There is, of course, a different kind of connection, I would say. But here, it's like thinking about things like anticipating how the audience will react. Sometimes even inviting them to participate or to see whether they can participate. There is, like we discussed earlier, there is a lot of give and take to spoken word. The audience and the poet, or at least in my experience, feed off each other. And that does affect the poem. And you can't really incorporate all of that. You can't really predict all of those energy shifts and flows to write it into the poetry. But it is a factor when you're constructing the poem, when you're structuring it, when you're writing it. So I think that's how those two differ a bit. And to answer the second part of your question, yes, it does feel different to perform in different cultural contexts, especially. Of course, it is different even in spatial context, in the sense that it is different to perform in, say, a university classroom, a university conference, something like that, to performing in a pub. It's very different energy, different vibe, and spoken word, I think, is about adapting to that vibe, which is always fun for me. But cultural context specifically, yes, it definitely feels different. I don't have a preference because each comes with their own set of pros and cons. My spoken word journey began in India, where performing still feels comfortable to an extent. And I didn't have to think about things I now consider performing here, things like my accent, pronunciation, whether references and images will translate culturally, and how my race might affect how I'm perceived and received. In India, those things were low on the list of priorities or things that I thought about. At the same time, though, performing in India was complicated by a deep-seated cultural expectation that the personal remain private. As you know, my poetry is very personal, and I was taught that there are some things you simply don't talk about. And frustratingly, those were the very things I wanted to talk about. India is home to incredible artists who are breaking down the walls between the personal, the public, and the political every day. For me, building that courage is a work in progress. And self censorship is something I'm still unlearning. I mean, what can I say? But what will people think is very etched in my into my bones. And like I said, it's still something that I'm unlearning. It feeds into my performance. It feeds into how I write and all of that. So yes, performing in India will always be a warm and familiar space. It is home after all, and the source of much of my inspiration. There is a certain kind of belonging and recognition only home can offer, which holds the performance in a special way, in a unique way. But I can't deny that it has been, for me personally, a liberating experience to perform in contexts that do not carry the expectations of home, where I personally wrestle less with the fear of being seen in all my vulnerability, honesty, and anger. Different places definitely come with different freedoms and frictions. But that being said, the act of sharing poetry always creates a space for connection, no matter where it is.
Amazing. Thank you for that answer. I love this image of freedom and friction and how they kind of maybe butt heads, but also how they can sit side by side. Also, while you were talking, it kind of made me wonder, a lot of your poetry, at least what I've read, does have some elements of humor in it. There are moments where when you're listening to it in a collective space and you're performing it, you get really big laughs. So for example, in the Outfit of the Day, one that you already read for us, the one of the last lines where you say, "And with great courage, thighs," got a huge laugh when you performed it. And I wonder how you find that humor translates between different contexts and different audiences.
That has been interesting as well. Humor is something that I've been playing with more recently in both poetry as well as in my fiction writing. And again, that really reflects a personal journey where I think I saw things very seriously at some point, and that has shifted quite a bit. I still do. I am still a very serious person, but I have space for humor now. And I didn't know when I started writing humor into my poetry and into my fiction if those things would translate again, if those things would work, especially in the UK context. Since they are rooted in India, they might make sense to other Indian women who would immediately get it, would see the humor in it, the relatability. But I didn't know how it would translate. And it has been really amazing to see that it does. Sometimes I get a laugh in places I'm not expecting, at points I'm not expecting in the poem. And that's always nice. It throws me a little because of the flow of the performance, but no complaints. I'm always thrilled when I do get a laugh. And I feel that my poetry is talking about broader things, maybe deeper things. And humor kind of gives you space to process that, to break it up instead of it being overly intense.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so on that note, I think now that you've kind of given us some context about your inspiration and kind of background as an author, I'll give you another space to do some readings.
The first of these two poems, which I have recently started reading together, is called If History Catches Up. Lonely street lamp in the night, cold and monstrous, noisy against a background of murmuring silhouettes. You do not, cannot, will not trust the light, magnifying glass with bared teeth, revealing blemishes under powder. But it calls out, frothy whispers on the shore, slow down, sit here a while, in the arms of a spotlight you've been betting on shadows for too long. Lie down now, rest your head next to the cradle song of a midnight sun. Let it replace the scent of hooves in pursuit. Stop, for a minute or two, consider inky telephone wires, trapeze artists stretched between branches. Stop for 10 minutes or so. Swap the glass of rot for the sleeping tar's steady breath. Your legs are weak from running in stilettos. Stop for the night. Sacrifice a dead heart to the motherly flame and let a new one grow in its place. Your lungs are tired from breathing in secondhand smoke. Stop here for good. Dismantle the memory of hurt children, bad daughters, difficult lovers. Build shelter with what remains a refuge for hurt children, bad daughters, difficult lovers. And if history catches up, arrives to hurl rocks through your windows, to unleash spirits in your freshly painted attic, to tear down bookshelves and uproot flower beds, so be it. After it has done its worst, ripped out tile and brick with its bare hands, blown through your rooms like a hurricane, drunk on destruction, threatened you with exile. We, hurt children, bad daughters, difficult lovers, we will rebuild right here in the light. The second poem, I'll go right into the second one. Like I said, I've been performing them together, even though they're different, and we'll come back to that later, I think. The second poem I'm performing is called The Women I House. It was written, just to give a little bit of an introduction, it was written before If History Catches Up, but I've started to perform it second. So here goes. The Women I House. In a dimly lit kitchen at the back of my mind, Arya tells Kiana, "Look here, you're a sledgehammer to these walls, the weakest link in our daisy chain, all the fragility of porcelain with none of the value." Kiana cries. Arya rolls her eyes. Elsewhere, Ria forgets everything Kathy told her about shopping for love in the clearance aisle. She bags the discounted fairy tale along with pimple patches and canned pineapple. And later, when love says it can only stay for the night, Ria puts up blackout curtains and dresses the ceiling in velvet, covering Kathy's 5-year plan with paper stars. Now Kathy is annoyed, and the two of them argue in whispers while a fairy tale snows in the bed they share. Ria apologizes profusely, but will be wrapped around the promise of a happy ending in minutes, picking dried-up devotion off yesterday's crust. And while she's doing that, Kathy will write a full-length essay on why she dislikes Arya, who asks stupid questions like, "What's the point of life?" before disappearing into a bunker of clouds. Kathy has no time for Arya's immeasurable pessimism. Arya has no capacity for Kathy's ambition, and neither of them can stand Kiana, who slips into melancholy every time she sees a sunset. The women I house are loud. Some days all I can hear is the sound of twisting metal in bone, hair yanked from scalps, spines, broken down into pearls for a necklace. The women I house are loud. They constantly scream over each other, struggling to get a grip on the steering wheel, handing out new instruction manuals every day. How to be confident, how to be sexy, how to be unfazed, how to convince this stranger you're confident and sexy and unfazed. I am still learning how to bring solace to their chaos, to drag them apart on some days, glue them together on others. When the world leaves rejection, hate, loneliness at the door in a brown paper parcel, Kiana sobs hysterically. Arya said she saw this coming from her tower, and besides, we kind of deserve it. Kathy says nothing but takes copious notes on what we could have done better. Ria says, "Please, please, please change your mind." And after swallowing years of anger, betrayal, despair, a loathing so deep it could be mistaken for an ocean, I say to all of them, I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. And for a while, there is quiet.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I almost didn't want to end the quiet there at the end. But of course, I have questions for you about your writing as well. So we'll have to end the quiet. Again, thank you so much. I love hearing you read your poems, and the kind of strength and emotion that I get from you is very powerful when I hear you read them. So yeah, to kind of step into a little bit more of a close reading of your writing, I wanted to begin by looking at If History Catches Up. I really love the way that you personify, or rather monsterify, history in this poem. And there's something very powerful and almost threatening in that imagery. And I really feel a sense of momentum throughout the poem as you're reading it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you arrived at that metaphor and what inspired this poem.
The metaphor in If History Catches Up unfolded over time, actually. It began as a note to self, a sort of reminder during a period when I was working through the messy, often uncomfortable and painful process of healing and growing. Part of that meant confronting not only past traumas, but also past mistakes I'd been trying to outrun for a long time. I carried this belief then that to become the version of myself I wanted to be, I had to erase every trace of all the people I'd been before. As I wrote and rewrote the poem, I reworked it quite a few times. It started reaching beyond the personal in some ways. I began to see how my desire to distance myself from my own history mirrored something much larger, something that is reflected in how histories, both personal and collective, are often used to control people, especially those from marginalized genders and communities. Where I come from and in many other parts of the world, women are constantly taught that deviation from the norm, standing out, speaking up in any way, makes them fair game for scrutiny. And that scrutiny isn't confined to the present. It starts looking backward, picking apart your past to discredit who you are now. Everything you've been and are is measured against what a collective history says you should be. And your personal history is almost turned into evidence to justify labels like bad and difficult and far worse. What I'm trying to say is that while history, both personal and collective, is very much a part of us, it doesn't define us entirely. It doesn't get to decide who we are allowed to become or how we relate to ourselves and to one another. We are allowed to grow beyond it, to see differently, to reimagine and to rebuild. And that was something I had to learn, I had to unlearn, I had to remind myself of. And I think if history catches up, attempts to do that for myself, but for other women as well and other people.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that insight. I think that it's really interesting to hear how you kind of started writing the poem, because upon my first listen, I think I absorbed a lot more of the broader, maybe more political, more widespread meaning of history. And I didn't think so much about how it could be rooted in personal history as well. So it's amazing to think about those layers that are in the poem. And I love to kind of hear you speak about it as well, because I think it solidifies how, when you read it, some of the lines almost feel like a chant. Like it feels like you could almost invite the audience in and they could catch on to that chant and you could be saying it together. And it feels like, especially when you use the collective we, it feels very powerful. So initially, when you sent me these poems, you mentioned that they are really closely connected. And by they, I mean the two that you just read, If History Catches Up and The Women I House. And I was wondering if you can give us a little bit more detail about this interconnection and how they both came to be, so to speak, and if this connection impacts the way that you perform them. You already kind of hinted about this, but if you could say a little bit more, that would be excellent.
Yes, If History Catches Up and The Women I House are interconnected. I didn't intend for them to be. They were both written separately, but they are. And now when I look at them side by side, I do see the connections, even in terms of style and things like repetition, things like choices that I make and how I've presented this information or this story. And both in how they came into being and in what they explore. Like I said, they were written separately, but they were shaped by the same personal journey of trying to find myself, as cliched as that sounds and as overused as that phrase is. I wrote The Women I House first, but I now see If History Catches Up as sort of setting the scene, presenting some context for the more internal conflict present in the former. And that's why I have started performing If History Catches Up before The Women I House and performing them together so that they function as sort of extensions of each other, right? They contribute to a conversation, a broader, larger conversation. The way I see it now, after having written them as standalone pieces, is If History Catches Up explores the idea of changing and growing without apology. And The Women I House tries to capture the complexities and the non-linearity of that changing and growing, which is not always straightforward. When I wrote The Women I House, I was weighed down by the question, who am I? I seemed to be multiple contradictory women who could not see eye to eye, who did not want the same things, and who would not come together as a cohesive whole, no matter how hard I tried. And that's really what the poem is about. I had a lot of anger for some versions of myself, and it took me a long time to work through that. It didn't help that I couldn't leave those versions of myself cleanly in the past. I still slipped back into them from time to time. They still existed within me. They still piped up and tried to grab the steering wheel, like the poem says. The becoming or the being I'm so fascinated with is not a straightforward shift as I once thought it to be, going from one fixed version of the self to another fixed version of the self that is meant to be better, improved. Writing the poem really helped me hold space for all versions of myself differently and to hold space for a multifaceted self that didn't really need to be fragmented or separated or divided. And also to just accept the different versions of myself with more kindness and with more love. And that's where I think the pattern of negative self-talk, of putting yourself in a box, I try to bring that out. I have tried to bring that out in this poem and to challenge it.
I think that you've almost anticipated my next question and your answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. And if there's anything else you want to add, then we can kind of continue to speak about this idea. Kind of going back to the poem you read at the beginning of the podcast as well, and thinking about it alongside the two that you just read for us, it seems that an underlying theme in your work is this idea of growing up and becoming a self and a whole individual, as you've essentially just vocalized in your answer as well. And if there's anything else you want to say about this, I think this is a really interesting aspect of your work. And I'm also curious whether or not this was a conscious inclusion when you started writing the poems, or if kind of this connecting theme arose naturally.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly conscious, I would say. In a way, I suppose it was. But this personal journey that I keep referring to and that is reflected in a lot of my work, it came alongside another journey, and that was my actual physical movement from India to the UK to do a PhD that in many ways I was really not prepared for. As a PhD student yourself, I'm sure you can relate to that feeling.
Definitely.
So when I came here, I had to reimagine myself in radical ways, in ways that were really difficult. I had to step up, and it was, I think I was constantly confronted by this is what I want to be, but I'm not yet this person. And it took me time to make peace with becoming as a process, and again to bring in a little of what I said earlier, to challenge being in this world as a singular entity or as something fixed. So, outfit of the day also does feed into that overarching journey. And also, all of these poems were initially written just from my own experiences and even as attempts to kind of just make sense of them for myself. But doing a PhD in very similar topics and research areas has helped me kind of situate them in broader patterns, in broader systems. Like you said, that even history, you thought of it in a more political sense. I had started thinking about it in a more personal sense, but it kind of grew into the political. I have to say that's true for most of my work. It starts from a very personal, I am frustrated, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm hurt, I'm happy, and I want to say those things. And then I kind of see how it has so many connections to broader conversations, to broader experiences, has potential to speak to those as well. So yes, it is very much the idea of growing up and becoming whole and becoming a self and finding yourself that is central to my work. But it is also, I think, moves outward from the personal to the public to the political. At least I hope that it does.
It's interesting that you can talk so coherently about the emotions that underlie in your work. And I think those emotions come out a lot when I read them and when I hear you perform them as well. And this is perhaps a slight divergence, but I am curious, because you perform these poems quite regularly, do you put yourself in the mindset of those emotions that maybe you experienced when you first wrote them when you go back and perform these poems?
Yes and no. I definitely feel them when I'm performing. I can, even if I don't feel them anymore in the same way or in the same intensity, I can I can remember them if if that makes sense. But also, I think that writing is one step and performing is another. And as much as I enjoy performing, I have struggled with being seen and with being known that way. I said that, I struggle less with that here in the UK or in different contexts outside of home. But it's not that there is no struggle at all. There is still very much a lot of embarrassment, shame, fear. All of those things really feed in. And, so I do feel the emotion, but it's also more that when I am performing, I have come to a place with great struggle, of course. I've come to a place where I've accepted the emotion. I've made my peace with it. That yes, I did feel these things, or yes, I did do these things, or yes, I used to be these people, and I still am, and that's okay.
Honestly, performance poetry takes so much courage. I'm always in awe of people who can go up there and be so vulnerable and so open with their work and with their selves. Okay, so my kind of final question about the poems that you've read for us today is that in listening to them, I think there's something really amazing in the way that your poetry positions the personal and the universal side by side. So we talked a little bit about the personal and the political in your work, but I'm also amazed at how the quality of universality really struck me when I first read your work, because we come from very different cultural, linguistics, geographical contexts, and I really see you and your experiences in your poetry. It's very apparent that it's rooted in your own life and your own identity. But I also find myself relating to it and thinking about the women that I house and the mathematical equations that go through my mind when I'm choosing my outfits of the day. And I'm curious if this universality is intentional at all. How do you feel about the fact that you've managed to strike this in between and that your poems might be relatable for all sorts of people?
It's actually been amazing to see those connections forming like right in front of me and in real time when I'm performing. I would have to say that the universality was not intentional. It's been incredible to see that there is universality, that people do relate to the experiences that I'm trying to capture, that I'm trying to present, experiences that are very much rooted in my own personal journey, my own personal experiences, but also, that they're in broader contexts of patriarchal definitions of understanding ourselves, of rebuilding, reimagining, disrupting structures of power, things like that. It has actually been very empowering for me to have those connections be made when I'm performing, to feel seen and heard, but also to feel like I am seeing and hearing others as well, and are holding space for them in some ways through my own experiences. So it wasn't intentional, but it honestly has been such a magical thing, and it's been a pleasure to see and to feel, and it it keeps me writing poetry and performing poetry, and it's probably the best part of all of this.
Amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. So I think the final thing is just to thank you so much for your time and for joining me for this conversation and for reading your poetry here on this podcast. I mentioned that I had the pleasure to attend one of your live readings recently here in York. And I wanted to ask as my final question if you have any upcoming projects, writing in progress, or performances that you would like to tell our listeners about. And if they're lucky, perhaps they live in the York area and or can keep an eye out for your name in the future.
I don't have anything coming up right now, nothing specific or planned, but I do perform from time to time. I definitely do open mics and I do shows. I just did one recently, which you attended, and it was amazing and lovely to see you there. I have an Instagram though that I am trying to build up, and I do announce my shows there, and give people plenty of time to get tickets and things like that. So if people do want to follow me on Instagram, it's just my name, and that would be amazing and greatly appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Just to say one final time, thank you so much for joining me today. And it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me. It really has been. It's been also eye-opening to kind of talk through these things that I don't usually get a chance to close read,
Yeah.
to do a close reading of my own poetry. And it has been very interesting. And thank you for having me.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.